Alright, so I wasn't expecting that to happen. We are back with the first new 10 years later video of 2022, and it's going up a bit later than I thought it would. I did not expect to get sick and have to play the is it a cold or is it COVID game again, and I'm still dealing with it a little bit. I still have a cough, so if I sound a little bit weird, sorry, but I'm just kind of getting over it a little bit, and the cough is the last thing to go away. But either way, we're here. We made it to 2022. I'm still wearing the same shirt that I wore at the end of my last video in 2021. Some things don't change, I guess. But regardless, welcome back to 10 Years Later, the series where I talk about albums from the 2010s that were either impactful to me, impactful to music in general, very popular, or just worth revisiting 10 years later for good or bad reasons. And I'm gonna have to get used to changing the number when I say these intros because it's a new year. So as you can tell from the title, the album that we'll be talking about today is the 2012 ScHoolboy Q record Habits and Contradictions. Top Dog Entertainment and Black Hippie's own ScHoolboy Q returned with this project as his second studio album in 2012. A year prior, ScHoolboy Q was the first of the Black Hippie artists to drop his debut album with Setbacks, and all three other members, Ab-Soul, Kendrick Lamar, and JRock, would follow suit with their debut albums across the rest of 2011. When I listened to Setbacks, I found it to be a pretty decent album, though one that obviously had some issues that debut records tend to have. Nothing overly concerning though, and I chalked a lot of those flaws up to it being his first album. Not every artist is gonna get it entirely right on their first try, and most debut albums are gonna leave room for improvement. Thus, I think I look forward to this album a good bit because I was interested in seeing how much Q was gonna be able to improve in such a short time. My stomach did drop a bit when I saw the record was 18 tracks in 67 minutes, although 3 of the tracks don't appear on streaming services for some reason. Thus, if you look on Spotify, it's 15 tracks in 54 minutes. Even with that length though, I was excited to see that Q cleaned up a number of issues that I had with Setbacks and put together a solid sophomore album. And while I wasn't surprised that this was an improvement for Q, I mentioned being nervous after seeing the long length of the album, and yeah, there are quite a few moments where the album succumbs to that length. Oxy Music is a tiptoeing dark song with a beat that sounds pretty reminiscent of Blow My High Members Only from Kendrick Lamar's Section 80. It's got a drugged out vibe, which makes sense given that the song deals with Q's past of selling Oxy. I do think his hard performance is a highlight of the song, and his cadence feels pretty cutthroat, but the instrumental doesn't stand out as much to me as I hoped it would. Not a bad song though, just not quite one of my favorites on here. My Hatin' Joint is a smooth, soulful jam produced by Mike Will Made It. It's got a pleasantly old school feel, which is a big contradiction to the lyrical content of the song, where Q is, as the title would suggest, hating. I love the beat, and I think Q does a pretty good job with it, though I think some of his spoken word interludes feel a little bit pace-breaking. They don't contribute much to the song itself, and they don't add much to it, honestly. Still a decently enjoyable song, even if it isn't one of my favorites on the record. And Tukey Nose is just a short interlude that makes reference to the late gang member Stanley Williams, aka Tukey. It's an extremely short interlude at just under a minute and a half, and there really isn't much to the track in terms of style or substance. It just feels like a bit of a lead-in without adding much to the album as a whole. Gangsta and Designer No Concept says it all in the title, as Q openly acknowledges that he wasn't going for a concept with this cut, he just wanted to say some shit. The instrumental has the big boastful drums that you might expect, but it also has some woodwinds backing it. I like the way they blend together, and Q owns the sound even if a few of his bars have obviously aged a bit poorly. My big issue is just that the hook doesn't really do all that much for me. It doesn't feel like it's as structured or as interesting as the verses, and it brings the song down a notch for me. Nightmare on Fig Street is the kind of track that has some loud, boisterous electronic production, but the lyrical content is rather introspective, as Q talks about his living conditions back on his former street, Figueroa Street. I think the instrumental has a lot going on, but it still manages to feel pretty unique and focused in spite of that. Q delivers his bars with plenty of conviction, and his performance is strong, but I do think this is another cut that could have used a better hook. It's decent, but that hook could have made it a bit more interesting. Then there's the song I'm just gonna call Already Know Davers Flow, where Q basically raps every single bar starting with the line people already know. Well, he uses a word other than people, but obviously, yeah, I'm obviously not gonna say what it is, I'll just let you see this. As it is, the instrumental feels a bit more minimal compared to a lot of the other songs here, and Q maintains his usual charisma, but I do think that flow can get a bit repetitive for my liking. I get what he was going for, and the concept certainly could have gone worse, but it just isn't as enticing to me. As far as the lowest of the low points, Sex Drive is obviously more of a sex-driven urban ballad featuring none other than Jhené Aiko. While Q's performance is as solid as ever, this track has possibly my least favorite instrumental on the album. The synth overload just feels way over the top, and it drowns out a lot of the potential sexiness that a song like this could have had. It totally overpowers everything on the track, and while Jhené brings her usual beautiful vocals to the mix, there are points where it's hard to even hear her because the synths are mixed way too loud. It just kills the song for me. How We Feeling is another track that doesn't appear on Spotify, and it once again plays deeply into the tripped out, drug-induced vibes of a few of the other tracks here. The song is so tripped out it almost feels like it's in slow motion. It's an interesting idea, but sadly there's just not enough structure to keep the song interesting for me. For a cut that's just over 3 minutes, there's shockingly little to chew over here, and it really doesn't do much outside of the unique production. I can understand why this isn't on streaming services, just because it feels like a pace breaker to the album. That said, this record does show a lot of improvement over Setbacks with a variety of hard-hitting tracks. Sacrilegious kicks off the album with a bass drum heavy beat building itself with these spacey guitar plucks, as Q spits some very somber lyrics about his experience with the street life. It's a really dark, emotional beginning to the album, where Q digs deep into some very personal stories with some very palpable emotion. Kendrick Lamar also appears on the hook, and while his integration is small and the structure of the chorus can be a bit repetitive, it works well for the song and he bounces off of Q pretty well. There He Go kicks things up a bit more than the opening track with a more bouncy but rather spacey banger of a beat, featuring a performance from Q that gives me some good A$AP Rocky vibes. He brings a lot of charisma and energy to his verse and makes the song even better. On a track like this where Q is flexing and giving a bit of a victory lap, I think having fun with the performance and going extremely bold is what you need to help sell it. Thus, Q's over-the-top vocal cadences that definitely feel like they could have been inspiration for a group like Brockhampton help make this a huge high point for me. Oh yeah, and you know how I was mentioning A$AP Rocky earlier? Well, guess what? He shows up on the album on the track Hands on the Wheel, which is built on a sample of Lissy's cover of Kid Cudi's iconic Pursuit of Happiness. The song has a drugged out vibe, but it still gets very bombastic with its pounding drums. Rocky comes through with a fantastic verse on the song that might be one of my favorites from him. He speeds things up but goes insanely hard and fits perfectly over this kind of production. It's not just him either. Q has just as much charisma to spare, and the chorus rounds things out nicely. I can definitely see how this became a favorite among ScHoolboy Q fans. It's a pretty awesome song. Raymond 1969 is one of the 3 tracks that doesn't appear on Spotify, and I can't figure out why. Production-wise, this feels like something straight out of an old-school black and white horror film. It maintains the hard vibe as it moves further along, but it still has something of a classic feel as well. This is the perfect kind of instrumental for Q, given that he's known for having an extremely cutthroat vocal tone, and he plays off of that with the instrumental. I'm honestly pretty sad this song isn't on Spotify because it's a huge high point on the album. Sexting starts off with a very creepy sample, which was honestly kind of weird to me given that this is a more sex-driven song where Q talks to the ladies. Even so, Q comes through with a really strong performance, as this beat was pretty much made for him. As much as I think the sexual lyrics feel like a weird dichotomy with this kind of production, the song as a whole still leaves a very good impression. Groovline Part 1 is another song that leans into the more sultry feel with a smooth instrumental sampling Feel Like Making Love by Marlena Shaw, and it features a light performance from Q that almost feels like a straight up R&B soul fusion. While the track is a lot more downbeat than a lot of what else is here, it feels like a strong attempt for Q to branch out in terms of genre and style, and I can respect that. Dom Kennedy and Currency also have very relaxed but enjoyable flows on their verses too. I think this is a cut that could have benefited from having a singer on it to round it out even more, but I think that could just be me nitpicking. Otherwise, I really enjoyed the song. Druggys with Hoes again is, as you may expect, the sequel to Q's Druggy with Hoes collaboration with Ab-Soul from Setbacks. When I first looked at Setbacks, I thought Druggys with Hoes was an example of Q getting outshined by a feature, as I felt Ab-Soul really stole the show. But I don't find that to be the case here. Q himself sounds amazing on top of what is a very bouncy electronic beat, and he and Ab-Soul play off of each other very well on the hook. Ab-Soul once again also fits perfectly over this kind of production on his verse, making this a nice improvement over the original track. My Homie is another introspective cut with production work from none other than The Alchemist. Here, over another very cinematic beat feeling reminiscent of an old school movie, Q talks about a former homie of his that he grew up with and was very close to, only for him to later become a snitch. The lyricism is pretty dark here. You can hear just how angry he made ScHoolboy Q and how betrayed he felt in the end. Even though the hook doesn't carry much structure, the song feels extremely memorable and stands out as what I can imagine is one of the most cathartic moments on the album, and maybe even Q's Q's entire discography. Blessed is the last of the 3 cuts that doesn't appear on Spotify, and it's perhaps one of the most hard-hitting moments on the record. The track sees Q offering a dedication to a friend of his that lost his son, and this loss makes Q realize just how many blessings he has in his life. The instrumental plays a lot into that vibe as it's very spacey and ethereal, almost feeling like a straight-up Drake beat. Q's bars are some of the best that I've heard out of him thus far, and he alone makes this perhaps the best song on the album. As if that isn't enough though, we get a beautifully sung bridge from Absol and Kendrick Lamar doing what he always does. His verse in and of itself is really interesting to me, as it almost sounds like he's fighting back tears as he raps it. It's definitely the most impactful song on the album, and I can't believe it's not on streaming services. 2 Raw closes out the album with a collaboration featuring the only other Black Hippie member I haven't mentioned yet, JRock. It's another soulful jam with a bit of a spaced out vibe, serving as another example of Q attempting to branch out into some other genres and hinting at more of an artful direction. His performance is as solid as usual, and while I wasn't sure about the chorus at first, it did grow on me a bit more, and I appreciated some of the hints at a melodic direction near the end of it. JRock also rounds out the song nicely with a verse that features some faster flows and hardened tones. I feel like Blessed could have been a better closer to the album, but all in all, this is a solid track to finish with. Overall, Habits and Contradictions is a nice improvement for ScHoolboy Q after his debut album, Setbacks. Q remains a very charismatic artist that can put together some hard-hitting performances, and more importantly, I think he cleaned up a good amount of my issues that I had with his first record. He continues to bring out the best of his features, but unlike his debut, it doesn't feel like he gets outshined by any of them. It feels like he proves that he can stand toe-to-toe with them, which is an especially great thing given that he's got some incredible talent alongside him on this project. Outside of some dated bars, I think he also improved his writing a good bit on this album with some lyrical concepts that hit way harder and stand out as being very memorable and very introspective. And production-wise, I think he manages to keep this from getting repetitive while also showcasing some decent attempts at dipping his toes into other genres. It feels like this record hinted nicely that Q was ready to step into a more artful direction with future albums. There are still some issues that hold the project back just a bit for me. As I mentioned, the track list remains a bit long and the album could certainly have been chopped down by a few tracks. There are also still a fair few moments where Q still sounds like he's working out those jumps into other genres, and I do still think some of the choruses could use some work. A couple songs could have hooked a bit more than they did, and that's probably the biggest criticism from Setbacks that remains on this album. Otherwise, yeah, this is a nice improvement for ScHoolboy Q that proved to me that Setbacks was just a case of inexperience and just getting a feel for how to put an album together. I haven't gotten to listen to them yet, but I'm very sure the next set of records is going to get even better from here. I know a lot of people have already said that albums like Oxymoron and Blank Face were huge improvements, so I can't wait to check those out. As it is, this is a very solid project that thankfully still sounds pretty good a decade later. Back in 2012, I don't think I would have had the appreciation of hip-hop to be able to enjoy this thing all that much. Listening to it now, I could say I did enjoy myself with it. If I had to put it on my scale, it would definitely get a good rating. Not the best record I've heard, and I'm sure Q's other albums will be even better, but this was a nice improvement on Setbacks and a good hint at some of ScHoolboy Q's future potential. But that's just my opinion on this album. What did you guys think about it? Did you listen to it back in 2012? Do you still listen to it now? Did you love it back then? Hate it back then? Do you still love it now? Do you still hate it now? Are you just completely indifferent towards it? Whatever your thoughts and experiences are, leave them down in the comments below. Let's keep this civil and have some fun as we like to do. If you guys want to hit like and subscribe and support some of my other ventures that I have linked in the description, thank you. If not, it's no big deal. I totally understand. This is the only January album that I'm going to be talking about for 10 years later this year, but I do have a couple albums that I tentatively do want to talk about in February. If all goes right, the next album that I'll be talking about is Fun's 2012 album, Some Nights. I say tentatively because I never really know if I'm going to actually have enough to say about an album until I listen to it, especially if it's an album I'm going to be listening to next month. But hopefully that'll be in the next video. If not, I'm sure I'm going to have plenty more to talk about in 2012, so stay tuned for that. But until then, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.